Welcome to the Geneva Connection Season 3, produced in collaboration with Building Bridges. Throughout this season, we explore perspectives from across finance, business, and innovation to understand how sustainable finance is evolving and where the next innovations and investment opportunities are emerging. As nature becomes financially material, how can investors shift from a risk-only perspective to seeing nature as a source of opportunity and resilience? And what does it take to build a credible, high-integrity, nature-first economy that investors can genuinely trust? Our host, Karen Hitschke, is joined by Marc Palahí and Margaret Kim to unpack how science, standards, and capital can align to reshape how nature is valued and financed. Let's dive in.
So, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about my opportunity to welcome Marc Palahí, Chief Nature Officer of Lombard Odier Investment Managers. Thank you so much for joining. And Margaret Kim, CEO of Gold Standard. I'm really delighted to have such experts here today at my podcast. And let's just jump right in. So today's topic is, how do you finance a nature-first economy with integrity? And I think you're both very well positioned to talk a lot about that. So maybe we'll just start with you, Marc. Why is nature becoming financially material? So obviously we know that fundamentally nature was treated for a long time as something more external to economic value. And today it's becoming financially material across sectors, from agriculture, forestry, to supply chains and even consumer goods. So why does nature matter to investors, and what does the science tell us about the consequences of not acting on nature?
Thank you, Karen. First of all, nature should matter to investors because not understanding, valuing, and investing in nature poses increasing risk to our economy. But it also misses great opportunities. In my opinion, the greatest business opportunities of the 21st century will emerge from nature, nature-based solutions, and circular bioeconomy supply chains, which are all rooted into nature. But let me also add a few basic ideas, which I think are very important. First of all, nature is what makes our planet special. Nature is the keystone infrastructure that regulates our entire planetary system. And that includes our climate, the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air that we breathe. But nature also is the basic fabric supporting all living processes on Earth, and that includes also all our economic activities. Even if our economic system does not realize that, because currently it derives value from price rather than price from value. Remember that bees, birds, and trees, they are not sending us bills for the great ecosystem services that they provide to our economy. And these services, by the way, are increasingly valuable in a moment of ecological scarcity. The challenge we are facing now is that because we have failed to value nature, now we are starting to pay the costs of its destruction. And it is especially true now when we have reached a tipping point and we are crossing the so-called planetary boundaries. Remember that we have not only changed the climate of our planet for the first time in human history, but we are also crossing the resilience boundaries of the planet due to the massive biodiversity loss, the degradation of our natural and managed ecosystems, and the accumulation of pollutants like plastics, antibiotics, pesticides. And to make it simple, when you cross the planetary boundaries, as we are doing today, what it means is basically that our environment, our planet, cannot any longer absorb for the shocks that our economy creates, which in turn it means that it's our own economy that needs to start absorbing for the shocks that it creates. And this is already happening today. If you look at the global insured losses due to the combined effects of climate change and nature degradation, they have doubled already in the last 10 years compared to the previous 10 years. But the direct economic losses of climate change and nature degradation are obviously much higher than the insured losses. And I think a very good example comes from our food systems. Every year, the agricultural sector is losing $100 billion due to the climate and nature-related disasters. In Europe, in the European Union, there is a very interesting recent report where the estimate is about 28 billion euros lost due to the increasing impacts of climate change and land degradation. So you see, not understanding, investing, valuing nature is already having huge economic effects. And I think now people, insurance companies, businesses are realizing, because we are reaching a tipping point. The good news, Karen, is that we also have the knowledge, we have the science and the technology to create a new economy that is, instead of prospering at the expense of nature and climate, prospers in harmony with nature. And this is what some of us call the circular bioeconomy, an economy powered by nature.
Right. Thank you so much, Marc. That's really intriguing. And I just moved to you, Maggie. So from your perspective, how are financial institutions beginning to recognize nature-related risk? So Marc has already outlined a few of them, in fact, very clearly. But how do you see from your perspective, and what is shifting in the market that really leads to assessing nature as a factor in long-term value?
Thank you, Karen. And I think Marc already gave a great sort of context to that. In many cases, nature and climate are interlinked, and therefore climate, nature, and people, they're not separate agenda. And I think more and more we're realizing that. And just coming back from Belém, it was quite obvious that climate discussion cannot be held separate without talking about its impact on nature and people. So obviously they're increasingly treated as connected systematic risks, requiring joint approaches to mitigation, adaptation, and resilience investment. And financial institutions are more and more recognizing nature loss drives material credit market and often litigation risks. So it's not just reputational risks that they're grappling with. It's going beyond. And this is particularly the case for dependencies on ecosystem services such as oil, soil and soil health, pollination, and food production. And we're starting to see regulation also moving in a way that it's starting to require it as mandatory, not optional. So for example, under the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 15 and rising disclosure frameworks like the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, financial institutions need to start assess, disclose, and manage their nature-related risks and dependencies. And also we're seeing capital access now linked to nature performance. So asset managers and banks and insurers are using nature risk assessment to price loans, insurance products, and investment decisions. So shifting nature from a sustainability issue to really a core value driver. There's still a long way to go, but we're starting to see those positive signals that are bringing different actors coming in the right direction.
Thank you. I think materiality is quite clear. I mean, we've heard examples from insurance losses. Also, what you were just saying, the connected risks with climate, nature, and people, and you have to look at it holistically. So how does that now look if you look at investability? Because we've talked a lot about risk. Yes, pricing loans, maybe depending on the risk that corporates are being exposed to. But let's explore a little bit how we think about investing in nature, which is the other turn of basically the other side of the coin. So let me maybe turn to Marc first. One of the questions we do hear quite often is, how can you make nature investable? I mean, what is investing in nature? So from your work, can you give some practical examples? What does it really mean if you invest in nature, regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, circular bio-based value chain? Give some concrete examples for our listeners so we understand that better.
Great. Look, let's go back to the example of food systems, because basically without food, there is not economy. The food systems are at the center of the nature and climate crisis, because food systems are both a main cause and a main victim of the nature and climate crisis. They are a main cause because the extractive approaches relying on fossil-based inputs that we have been using to produce our food have developed at the expense of nature and climate. Food production represents 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions, but it is also linked in a way or another to 80-90% of the biodiversity loss happening globally. And it is a big thing because these same extractive approaches that we have been using are increasingly resulting in degraded landscapes, because obviously we are eroding biodiversity. Without biodiversity, there is no resilience, no adaptive capacity. And those landscapes now have become not resilient to the impacts of climate change and extreme events in a moment where extreme events, droughts, floods are becoming more frequent and intense than ever. Additionally, in our food systems, we have very often very complicated and long supply chains, 15, 20 intermediaries that are extracting value in the supply chain. Most of the value is downstream, so capital is not flowing upstream to those that are the custodians of our landscapes, the farmers, and also going towards the solutions, nature-based solutions that should build resilience in the system. So the good news is that we have the knowledge to reverse the situation. And science is very clear about the fact that investing in nature-based solutions and regenerative practices is the most cost-effective strategy that we have to produce food while mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change, building resilience in the system. This is what regenerative farming does. Regenerative farming is about producing food while or through enhancing biodiversity and increasing the health of our soils. Basically, it's about replacing synthetic inputs like fertilizers and pesticides by biological inputs. It is also about minimizing disturbances, tilling and using monocultures, and maximizing biodiversity above ground and below ground. Okay, when you use regenerative farming, first of all, you reduce emissions because you are replacing the synthetic inputs by biological inputs, but you are also increasing the carbon sinks because since you are using biological inputs to restore soils and above ground biodiversity, you are transforming a system that results in negative environmental externalities into a system that supplies ecosystem services, and we can quantify that. But in addition, because you are restoring biodiversity, because biodiversity is your main input into the system, you are building resilience in the system to cope with extreme events. But it has also an economic implication, because since you are reducing these synthetic inputs, you are reducing the cost. Since you are reducing disturbances, the use of machinery, you are also reducing your energy cost. And you are building resilience and increasing the profitability. So how we can invest in all these solutions? One example, you could invest in companies that are playing a catalytic role in the food value chain. Let's call them food value chain operators. These food value chain operators are companies that are operating in a regenerative way farms and are sourcing regenerative products from farmers and have the capacity to process and distribute those products to consumer brands. Okay? So basically, companies that have the capacity to vertically integrate the supply chain to avoid those intermediaries that I was saying before, so that then we can also invest more capital into the farmers from where they are sourcing products. So you could develop a growth equity fund to invest in these champions that will have a catalytic effect, because instead of sourcing 10 regenerative farms as they are doing today, we will provide them the capital so that they will stimulate 100 farms in their network, and that they will be able to provide these products instead of volume 3 multiplied by 100 or 50 times those volumes. This could be a growth equity strategy to invest in companies that will catalyze investments and activities that will restore biodiversity. You could also provide private credit to farmers so that they transition from conventional agriculture to regenerative farming, which requires know-how and capital, because these transitions takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But in some cases, you could also develop a real asset fund to deploy CapEx, so that you can transform landscapes from landscapes that are resulting in carbon emissions, negative environmental externalities, into landscapes that will produce food or produce fiber for fashion industry while generating ecosystem services. Yeah, so there are ways to invest. And for me, my obsession, my ambition is to invest in nature to transform our economy rather than to offset for its failure. I think this is for me, the fundamental goal is how we understand value and invest in nature to transform our economy, which is not fit for purpose. Because literally, in many senses, it's collapsing.
And just a quick follow-up question on that, because you described really vividly how this could work. Are there funds out there who are using already that strategy where people invest and they are like this growth fund you were explaining or you were talking about?
There are few examples, but there are very, very few, too few. And this is my ambition in Lombard Odier, is to develop an investment ecosystem consisting of a number of mutually reinforcing funds, growth equity, private equity, real assets, private credit, but all the funds, that are built around nature-based solutions. And I think like this is where we can really catalyze and deploy capital at scale. Yeah, so I think this is my ambition in the next 10 years, to develop a range of funds that mutually support each other, and hopefully many others will copy this because we need, hundreds of or thousands of funds like this.
I think that sounds like a great goal. So I'd be completely aligned with that. Now,
yeah, my colleague is smiling. You're smiling a lot.
I think we are all on board here. Maggie, let me turn to you. So we've talked about what is possible in investing in nature, but that also requires trust of investors that, what they invest in, they know that these outcomes are real, they're measurable, and they are long lasting and not just temporary. So from a integrity perspective, what makes a nature-based business model credible and investable? So how do we ensure that that trust is being built and people know they have the outcome they've been investing in beyond the financial return?
I was smiling because Mark's holistic view of looking at impact and the impact on global economy, the economic model of it's music to my ears. So standards like us operate to basically ensure integrity and credibility of that investment and the claim thereafter. So one of the most important things is strong integrity is a foundation. So what that means is investors are much more sophisticated as they've experienced the 2 decades of carbon markets. So a lot of investors look for science-based baselines, clear additionality, robust MRV, to prove performance, permanence, and impact over time. It's not to say there's no sort of room for failure and learning, but investors are more and more keen to understand what kind of integrity foundations these projects or investments are going into. And in that defining of that integrity, it's not just about baseline and MRV, but it's also about integrated multi-benefit design. So I think Mark's example was a good illustration of how mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and economical livelihoods and economical gains for communities all come into one place at a landscape level. So models that combine carbon, nature, social outcomes, really tackling the root causes and offering climate resilience, biodiversity gains in some of the nature projects, and community benefits all simultaneously, they become the definition of high integrity. And also these projects and programs need to start to align with policies and global frameworks. So credible models align with national regulations and global frameworks like the Global Biodiversity Framework, or if you're in the UK, Biodiversity Net Gain Policy. So there are policies that require certain elements. And if you can start to align with that, then naturally the project or program can increase policy durability and investor confidence. And Mark talked about really important point on landscape and stakeholder based governance of these investments. Investors trust landscape level multi-stakeholder models that really engage the local stakeholders. So obviously Gold Standard's been a huge promoter of having the right stakeholder engagement as part of the key requirement, and the landowners, the indigenous people, because basically making sure they're part of the solution and bringing them together in the journey, that naturally reduces the risk and improve permanence and success of those outcomes you're trying to drive in these programs.
And I think that's also what you said when we were briefly speaking about Belém, how the recognition that you can't really separate these different impact variants anymore, climate, nature, people, it's really related. You need to look at it holistically. There's no way you can try and separate or play them off each other in a way. Just quickly to continue on that, do you have a practical example how that really would be implemented? Again, to make it very tangible for our listeners.
So obviously we've been operating in the carbon markets, and we also have strong pipeline of projects that focus on nature and reforestation, afforestation projects to sustainable agriculture projects, our newest sort of RICE methodology. All of these basically rules are set. So going from that baseline to MRV, we certainly follow the science-based baseline and require strong MRV process, the monitoring, reporting and verification process along the way. Some nature projects are starting to look at remote sensing, digital MRV solutions, and modeling approach to further enhance the transparency and confidence in the data collection. And so the standards can be used quite wisely to ensure that integrity piece is really taken into consideration, not only as an ex post consideration, but from a design stage all the way to investment closure and delivery and monitoring. So we support many of these nature projects, but not enough. As Marc said, there are not enough financial vehicles. I think the projects itself as well, there are not enough projects that are coming through that drives that larger scale nature consideration.
And Marc, just building on that in terms of the standards, you're really deeply rooted in science. So from your perspective, how do you see the role of standards and integrity to see that these nature-based solutions really deliver what they promise, and in both senses, economically and ecologically?
No, that's fundamental, because first of all, they need to be scientifically sound and proven in a way, should be rooted in the best science. And this is one of my roles as Chief Nature Officer in Lombard Odier, is to develop our own frameworks, our own principles for investing, our own criteria and KPIs, how we are going to measure progress and impact of the funds that we are going to develop for nature, for climate. And as Maggie mentioned, we have a very holistic vision because, for example, in nature, you cannot separate carbon from biodiversity. Actually, carbon follows biodiversity in the long term, like mitigation follows adaptation. So, and it's very important to have these frameworks that have a long-term vision of what we want to achieve, and then articulate that through KPIs that are easily to monitor on an annual basis. For me, carbon should never be a goal. And you might think, what are you saying now? Carbon should be a consequence. No, because, in nature, carbon is not a goal. It's a consequence. When you have a healthy ecosystem, it will sequester carbon. So if you focus on creating the conditions of the ecosystem that is biodiverse, is healthy, don't worry. The ecosystem will sequester carbon. Maybe it's lower than if you go through a monoculture approach, but that monoculture is not going to be a resilient solution in the long term. And this is one of my main tasks on building the frameworks and having a scientific understanding of nature, and how do we translate all this scientific understanding of nature to this financial language, which I can tell you that is not easy. It took me, the last 2 years to find a common language with my colleagues in Lombard Odier, but now things are accelerating and becoming very exciting.
That's super encouraging to hear that, bringing it into the financial sector and really see how it's being adopted, and then adopted at scale, so we can really see how we can replicate and scale up the investments that is so desperately needed. Now, there's a bit of a sensitive issue or topic, which is like, how do we not misuse nature? So, and you were already alluding to that, Mark, to say, basically nature needs to be the goal. It's not like offsetting the destruction that has been done, but rather thinking in a nature positive sense. So one of the pitfalls is that also treating nature as a tool for offsetting, and a simple tool in a way, just reducing it to that rather than seeing how it can really be the foundation for economic resilience and value creation in a much more positive sense. So how do we avoid repeating the mistakes of the past and ensure that these nature-based interventions are really pursued for the real-world impact and not a shortcut? And this question goes to both of you, so whoever wants to take it first.
Let me go first. I'm smiling because this is indeed an interesting topic that's emerged over the last few years. I do have to stress the point my colleague Mark mentioned earlier. Carbon is a consequence. If you have a good, resilient, adapting program, you are bound to have good mitigation, sustainable mitigation outcome. If you have a good, sustainable mitigation outcome, it's very likely that your program has considered good adaptation, resilience building around communities and nature. So nature cannot be an offset. And we've heard in recent years where biodiversity credits are being mentioned or developed, the reason why carbon market works is not because it was used as offsetting, because the corporates had a reason to claim its carbon accounting and report against certain disclosure requirements. And for me, the nature is following that, but not from an offsetting perspective, but a claim perspective. So how do you invest and claim the nature positive contribution and nature risk contribution? So I think it's really important to understand that nature is not an offset. It's risk management, value creation, and nature projects must be framed as a tools to reduce systemic risks and support the resilience and really secure ecosystem services. And as I always say, if you want to build a market-based mechanism, whatever that may be, you need to have a demand. And demand has to be understood under global frameworks, under regulatory frameworks, under reporting requirements, why that claim is needed. So I think it's premature for us to think about nature in a credit or a market-based term just yet. However, I do see that existing markets, existing infrastructures of carbon markets doing a lot more in driving finance into nature and resilient community building.
Yes, my vision, as you could see, is very clear. I think we should move from offsetting tactics to insetting transformative strategies that are built around nature-based solutions. And I think we cannot talk about, or we should not allow in the standards companies to offset using nature-based solutions unless they have already a clear strategy and they are acting to transform their supply chains to make it nature and climate positive. For example, a chocolate company, nowadays, you saw what happened last year. Their cocoa production collapsed in West Africa because also the way we have been producing cocoa using monocultures that have expanded at the expense of natural forests, using also pesticide fertilizers. So it's a system that is collapsing because it cannot cope with extreme events in a moment that they are becoming more frequent and intense. But it is also a system that is a source of carbon and erodes biodiversity. So a chocolate company that is sourcing cocoa from those areas should not be allowed to offset and buy carbon credits somewhere else, because their homework is to really invest in those supply chains, in those landscapes through agroforestry systems, regenerative farming, so that the system becomes healthier, biodiversity positive, and carbon positive. So I think standards should make sure that companies that want to buy, carbon credits or invest in carbon credit projects should be doing their homework. So it cannot be used for offsetting. So for me, carbon credits, biodiversity credits could be a complement. Chocolate company should invest first in transforming those landscapes. And then obviously they could complement in the surrounding landscape with the local communities to restore natural forests that will help at the end also in that landscape and in that supply chain. So I think it should be very much more local, site-dependent, holistic approaches. And I think probably that, Maggie, could be something for the standards to develop in the future. That, okay, the carbon credits or biodiversity credits that you can acquire should be coherent within your value chains and the landscapes you depend upon, so that you have a localized strategy. And I think then it would make sense. But I think there is a lot to do in that sense. Companies need to do their homework first.
Just to add there, fully agree. I think two things. One to look out for is if you look through Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI's new net zero standard, it starts to clarify when carbon credits can be used, and therefore some of the nature claims that's inherent in the carbon project. So I think that concern you raised, Mark, it will be hopefully clearer to the corporate sector and SBTI members to clarify. And second one is it's really important what Mark said. The standards role is also to create that standard system and methodologies to look at the landscape level. I think that's critical. If we're looking at nature, it cannot be just at a single activity level or intervention level. It's very likely that it's going to touch the whole landscape and communities that's included in that. So how to create that holistic sort of rules to drive that integrity and practice going forward is something that Gold Standard's working on, and would love to speak to visionaries like Mark going forward.
Great. In fact, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is much more forward-looking. So if you look 10 years ahead, what would a mature nature-first economy look like, both from a scientific, ecological, economic standpoint? Mark, maybe you want to start with that.
Yeah, I am an optimistic person, but I think you're even more optimistic, because in 10 years' time, I don't see unfortunately, a mature nature-first economy being ready. I think you could say that the nature-first economy is in a baby, is a baby for the moment, 1 year, 2 years old. Nowadays, still you could say that 90% of our economy is extractive and fossil-based, to make it very simple. So for me, it will be a big achievement if in 10 years, by 2030, we have moved from this 10%, which is my own estimate, just to make it simple, we moved to a 25%. And, the investment funds we are developing now, in 10 years, will have delivered already a few big champions. The new Teslas of nature, the new companies that are showing the way. And hopefully by then we have a few of these nature Tesla companies that are showing the way how you are restoring biodiversity while producing food or producing cotton or producing construction materials to replace steel and concrete, And also for me, what we will realize in 10 years, and that will be a big success, is that a nature-based economy, a nature-first economy performs better, is better performing economy. So, we are not doing it for altruistic things or because nature is nice and we need to tick the box. It's because, understanding the system, investing in this system and in the science and technology that unlocks that potential delivers a better economy. Simply like that. It's better performing, healthier for humans, healthier for ecosystems, more profitable, less costly. So I think for me that will be the big aim, and the next 10 years are going to be obviously very exciting, because some of us are already, developing the new examples of how the economy needs to look in 40, 50, 60 years. But we need to be also realistic that we will see a lot of collapses in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, we have changed the thermodynamics of the planet. Just to give you a very simple fact that is pure physics. Every degree that our climate becomes warmer, the atmosphere contains 7% more water. This is a thermodynamics equation, basically, which means that in the dry seasons, the atmosphere will suck or is sucking already 7% more water from our land. It means that in the wet season, the atmosphere is throwing 7% more water. This is why droughts and floods are becoming more frequent and intense. And this will increase only in the next years. It's only going to increase, which means that many supply chains are going to collapse and many landscapes are going to suffer a lot. Unfortunately, this is sometimes the only way we change, because it's why I mentioned before that now our economy is starting to absorb all the shocks, and we are going to see that happening. Hopefully that will accelerate the change. Yeah. But so this is my view for the next 10 years. A lot of excitement, a lot of things happening, but we need to reach this teenager phase in 10 years' time. And then things will accelerate fast and fast.
From my side, in 10 years' time, God, it's literally around the corner if you think about the last 10 years. But what I hope to see is, Marc talked about his ambition in 10 years to grow these sort of funds and financing facilities to scale and replicate. For me, I fully support that. I want to see that. And all of those funds and investments and interventions that use strong, high integrity frameworks and standards to articulate the impact and be very credible and proud to take claims around it. I think that would be a hopeful future that I would like to see. And when it comes to nature specifically, I want to see a world in 10 years where nature is no longer talked about in isolation and climate is not talked about in isolation, but that holistic landscape level investment is starting to become a norm, and standards play a role in ensuring integrity and credible claim around that. That would be my dream, and I want to stay very positive and hopeful that will be reached.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was very inspiring. I think it's really good to leave our listeners with that dream and that vision to say what can happen in 10 years' time. We will not have, as we just heard, a mature nature-first economy, but if we can show and demonstrate that there are real champions and this, in fact, the right way to go, economically and ecologically, and for the people, I think then we've achieved quite a big goal in 10 years' time. So hope we can all make that work together. Thank you very much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure, and looking forward to continuing that dialogue, in fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you for listening. We hope you found this conversation inspiring. And as Karen said, let's work together to make that future possible for people and for the planet. Please stay connected for what's ahead. Subscribe, visit our website for more insights, and follow us on LinkedIn. We look forward to having you with us for what comes next. And until then, a warm goodbye from Geneva.